Death itself was no escape from beauty's reach. Bodies were washed, hair combed, hands folded neatly over the chest. Sometimes a pinch of rouge was applied to the cheeks of the deceased to give them the appearance of peaceful sleep. Wealthier families might even commission a death mask, a wax or plaster cast of the face, smooth to erase lines, as if the person had been restored to their most perfect self in the afterlife. You may close your eyes. Imagine we are seated together in the hush of a long-forgotten chamber. The air is warm with the scent of beeswax candles. A small window lets in only a trickle of moonlight. My voice is steady, almost like the sound of a slow river, and I begin. I'll not tell you a fairy tale tonight. What I am about to share is not about queens in jeweled crowns or princesses waiting in high towers. It is about women who lived and suffered under the rules of beauty that the Middle Ages carved deep into the flesh and hearts of so many. I remember my first evening in the castle solar, the warm room where the ladies gathered to sew, read, and whisper. I was perhaps 16, still new to the court, still wearing my hair as it grew naturally, thick and unruly, a warm brown that caught the sun. The elder lady, Dame Marguerite, approached me with a look of disapproval so slight it could have been mistaken for concern. But her eyes lingered at my hairline. "Child," she murmured, "you will want to pluck that hair from your brow if you wish to look refined." I had heard of it, of course. The fashion for a high, smooth forehead had already spread across France and England, carried from Italy like a precious secret. A broad, unbroken expanse of pale skin, free of a single stray hair, was the mark of a noble woman, and so the girls and women took to it with tweezers of bone or heated knives, pulling each hair until tears blurred their sight. Some even shaved back the hairline entirely, rubbing the skin with pumice stone to keep it bare. I remember the sound, the tiny ripping sound, multiplied 100-fold as the plucking went on, and the trembling that followed. It was the first time I learned that beauty could hurt, and not just for an hour, but for years. That night I lay in my bed with a tingling, reddened brow, wondering if anyone could truly think it was beautiful, or if we were all pretending because the court expected it. They told us pale skin was the truest mark of beauty, not simply fair, but untouched by sun, as if we had never worked a day outside. Pale meant noble, pale meant delicate, pale meant you belonged indoors, protected. But the truth was, many of us did go outside, and so came the powders, mixtures of lead and vinegar, sometimes with ground bone or chalk. They were painted over the face and neck until the skin seemed almost translucent. No one told us, at least not loudly, that the lead would sink into our bodies, blackening the gums, clouding the mind, weakening the bones. I remember the taste, metallic, faint but present, at the back of the throat. I remember the headaches that followed after days of wearing it. And yet, when you stood before a mirror polished from bronze, you saw what the world wished to see, a face like a porcelain set in a church window. And the hair, the hair was a story of its own. Golden was the favoured hue, though not all of us were blessed with it naturally. So, concoctions were brewed, mixtures of saffron, alum, and even pigeon dung, steeped in lye or vinegar, then spread thickly on the hair before hours of sitting in the sun. In summer, the ladies could be seen on the castle terraces, their heads wrapped in gauze soaked in the mixture, eyes half closed against the light, enduring the smell and the sting. In winter, the process was slower, but no less determined. Some whispered of Italian waters, more potent, they said, but dangerous. I once saw a girl named Isabel who had used them. Her hair was the color of ripened wheat, yes, but brittle, snapping at the ends, falling out in clumps when she combed it. She wept, and yet she smiled through her tears when the steward's son told her she looked like the Virgin in the chapel's mural. We also learned to value a small mouth, bow-shaped lips, and narrow shoulders. A rounded belly was not unfashionable. In fact, it suggested fertility, but it was the face, the hair, and the hands that bore the greatest scrutiny. Hands were to be soft, uncalloused, and white. There were ointments made from lily root and goat's milk for this, and gloves sewn from fine linen to be worn at night after rubbing the fingers in almond oil. And yet, as I sat with the other women in the dim candlelight, I began to see it, the weariness in their eyes. We laughed together, of course, but beneath the laughter there was something else, a silent, shared knowledge that these rituals were not choices, not truly. They were obligations disguised as desires. That winter, a feast was held for the visit of a neighboring duke. The hall was draped in tapestries of green and gold, the tables heavy with roasted meat, candied fruits, and flasks of spiced wine. But before the feast, the women gathered in the dressing chamber. The air grew thick with the smell of vinegar hair rinses, the powder of crushed pearls, the faint sharpness of lead paste. I remember one of the girls, Cecily, growing pale, paler than her painted face, as she swayed and caught herself on the edge of a table. We sat her down, loosened her gown, and pressed wine to her lips. She recovered enough to attend the feast, smiling, speaking gently, every movement careful, but I noticed she touched nothing on her plate. Later, I learned she had been fasting 4 days to keep her figure graceful for the occasion. I think, perhaps it was that night I began to keep these memories, these small details of how beauty was made and unmade in our world, because in each face I saw, beneath the powders, behind the plucked brows and gilded hair, there was the quiet truth that we were molding ourselves to a pattern not of our own choosing. And I wondered, even then, if anyone, centuries from now, would see through the smooth foreheads and pale skin and realize what it cost. I pause now, letting the candlelight flicker in the silence. The fire pops softly in the hearth, and in that stillness, you might almost hear the rustle of silk skirts in another century, and the sigh of a woman leaning toward a mirror, wondering if she will ever be beautiful enough. I invite you to settle again, to let your breathing slow, as though we are seated together in a small cloister garden at dusk. The air is cool, the scent of lavender lingers, and the sound of my voice drifts slowly, like the turning of a page in a forgotten book. I remember when I first understood that beauty was not only a matter of fashion, but a matter of morality. It was in the chapel, the pale winter light spilling through the stained glass like drops of honey on stone. Father Guillaume spoke from the pulpit that day, his voice carrying through the cold air. A woman's beauty is the mirror of her virtue. He quoted the saints and the holy texts and spoke of how outward appearance reflected the purity or corruption of the soul. To the men in the pews, it was an idea that seemed poetic, perhaps noble, but to the women, It was a warning. If you were plain, it could be read as a failing of your spirit. If you were too beautiful, it could be seen as a temptation, a sin, a sign that you had the devil's favor. There was no safety in the middle ground. The church's influence seeped into every choice we made. Even the colors we wore were touched by it. Modest tones, deep blues, soft grays, browns, suggested humility. Bright reds or golds could be admired, but also whispered about vanity, pride. I learned early that my hair, once plucked and smoothed, was to be covered in the presence of men not my family. The church said it was for modesty, but I could not help wondering, if beauty was so dangerous, why were we trained, from youth, to create it so carefully? There was another, quieter force at work, the court's endless appetite for display. Every feast, every tournament, every visit from a noble household became a stage, and we, the women, were the living decorations. We were dressed, painted, arranged like tapestries come to life. It was a strange balance, the church telling us to be modest, the court urging us to be dazzling, and between the two, we walked a narrow road, where one misstep could ruin a reputation. Too much paint, too much color, too much laughter in a man's direction, and a rumor could spread like spilled wine across a white cloth. And so the rituals grew more intricate and more dangerous. The pale skin that was so prized did not always come from nature or gentle powders. I recall the older ladies' secrets, a paste made from lead carbonate, ground to a fine dust, then mixed with vinegar or rosewater. It went on smooth, cool to the touch, and gave the face a luminous glow under candlelight. But the glow came at a cost. The skin grew dry, then greyish beneath the powder, forcing one to wear it constantly to hide the damage. And the body, the body paid too. Lead sickness crept in slowly, showing itself in trembling hands, aching bones, blackened gums. Yet, we told ourselves it was worth it, for a season or two of admiration. There was another method, one far more dangerous, whispered about with both awe and fear. The use of belladonna, the deadly nightshade. In Italy, it was said, women would drop its juice into their eyes, dilating the pupils to give them a soft, luminous look. The name itself meant beautiful woman, but belladonna was a poison, and its beauty was as false as it was fleeting. Blurred vision, headaches, even blindness could follow. Still, some did it, especially those who had heard stories of Venetian courtesans whose gaze could melt the heart of a prince. I never dared try it, though I saw the glimmer in the eyes of a visiting lady once, dark pools so wide they seemed to drink in all the light of the room. She smiled as if holding a secret. Later, I heard she could no longer read her prayer book without pressing it close to her face. Perfumes, too, carried their dangers. True perfume was costly, made from rose, jasmine, or ambergris brought from distant lands. But many women used cheaper imitations, steeped in mercury or arsenic to preserve the scent. Mercury, they said, could also smooth the skin, though at the cost of soes, trembling, and madness in the end. The irony was bitter. We sought to preserve our beauty, yet the very tools we used were slowly unmaking us. The social pressures were relentless. A lady's value at court was tied not only to her family name or her dowry, but to her appearance. Matchmakers spoke not just of lineage or estates, but of skin like ivory, hair like spun gold, hands like silk. Marriage was not always a choice, but it could be a survival. And so, for many, the gamble was simple: risk your health for a chance at a better match, or remain overlooked, a shadow on the edge of the hall. I remember a girl named Ale, from a family of little wealth. She was sweet-faced but plain, her skin tanned from tending the garden. Over one summer, she changed. Her face grew paler to pale, and she began to wear gloves even in the heat. The other women guessed she had begun the lead paste. By autumn, she was engaged to a merchant's son with connections to the Duke. But the last time I saw her, after the wedding, there were faint blue lines at the edges of her gums, and her smile, once so warm, had grown weak. The church, for its part, could both condemn and praise beauty. The Virgin Mary was painted as the most beautiful of women, serene, flawless, and saints were often described in terms of their radiance. Yet, vanity was listed among the deadly sins. We were told to be like Mary, pure, beautiful, humble, but without seeking beauty for ourselves. It was a riddle with no answer, and we were the ones expected to solve it daily, with our own bodies as the parchment. And so, each morning began with the same quiet ritual: a basin of cool water, a cloth soaked in rosewater or vinegar, the plucking of stray hairs from the brow, the smoothing of the hairline, the mixing of powders. I learned to do it without thought, my hands moving while my mind wandered elsewhere, to the sound of the bells from the chapel tower, to the rustle of the wind in the courtyard, to memories of a time before I knew that beauty could be dangerous. But once you know, you cannot unknow. And as I looked around me, at the powdered faces, the hidden sores, the eyes made dark with poison, I began to wonder if the greatest cruelty of all was not the pain, not the sickness, but the fact that we believed it was our own choice. I pause here, letting the cool night air drift in through the open cloister arch. Somewhere far off, a bell tolls. You can almost see the women of the court, like faint figures in the half-light, painting their faces in silence, each one hoping to be seen, and yet fearing it at the same time. Imagine now that we are standing before a heavy oak door. I push it open slowly. The hinges sigh. Inside, the air is warmer, scented with lavender, vinegar, and the faint bitterness of ground lead. The light comes from narrow windows and a scatter of candles, their flames bending when the door closes behind us. The dressing room was the truest theatre of the court, not the great hall, not the ballroom, but here, in the quiet space where no men were permitted without invitation, where the women prepared themselves to be seen. It was never silent. There was always the rustle of gowns being laced, the clink of pins dropped into shallow bowls, the whisper of brushes through hair. Servants moved quickly between their ladies, carrying basins of warm water, linen cloths, pots of ointments. Some of the servants were girls no older than 14, hands still clumsy, but learning the craft of transformation. Others had served for decades, and could lace a corset or twist a braid with their eyes closed. My own maid, Beatrice, was one of the latter. She had been my mother's maid before me, and there were times I wondered how much she had seen. How many mornings of plucked brows and painted cheeks she had attended. Her hands were gentle but firm, and she never asked whether I wished to follow the fashion. She simply prepared the tools, as if it were as natural as breathing. And perhaps, by then, it was. In the far corner, the Countess de Vienne sat before a polished metal mirror. Two maids hovered behind her, one braiding thin ribbons into her hair, the other dabbing at her face with a cloth steeped in vinegar and rosemary. The Countess was known for her beauty, and also for her temper. Neither maid dared speak unless spoken to. At another table, Lady Isolde inspected her reflection with narrowed eyes, tilting her head as her maid dusted her cheeks with crushed pearl powder. It gave the skin a luminous, almost ethereal glow, but I had heard that it tightened the face until the muscles ached. The servants were the silent keepers of these rituals. It was their hands that applied the dangerous pastes, that poured the vinegar rinses, that tightened the laces until the breath came shallow. They knew which lady preferred her brows plucked to the quick, which one favored the Italian saffron rinse for her hair, which one liked a hint of rouge, despite the church's frown upon it. And though they were not bound to follow these standards themselves, at least not to the same degree, they were bound to uphold them for others. It was not only noble women who felt the weight of beauty's demands, though. In the kitchens, in the market, in the weavers' guild, women too were judged, though by a different scale. A merchant's wife might not wear pearl powder, but she would still be praised for pale skin, a slender waist, a clean and orderly appearance. For those who labored outdoors, washerwomen, field hands, the ideal of untanned skin was nearly impossible. They were often mocked for it, as if sun-browned arms were a sign of moral failing, than proof of endless work. In the noble courts, beauty was currency. Among the working classes, it could still be a ticket to survival, a better marriage, a kindermaster, a place in a wealthier household. And so the same ideals trickled down, reshaped for each rung of the ladder. I once met a laundress named Corlette, who worked in the castle. She told me, in a voice half joking and half bitter, that she sometimes dusted her cheeks with flour before going to the market. It made her feel more respectable, she said, though it itched and made her sneeze. Back in the dressing room, the morning ritual went on like a small, private war against the body's own nature. Hair was tamed, skin was painted, waists were bound. Those of us with maids had the work done for us, but we were still the ones enduring it. I remember the feel of the comb pulling through my hair, the sting of the tweezers at my brow, the cool, heavy touch of powder on my cheeks. Beatrice rarely spoke during these moments. Perhaps she sensed that I drifted elsewhere in thought, to the sound of the courtyard below, or the smell of bread baking in the kitchens. But there was no escaping the final act. Once prepared, we would stand before the mirror, or before our ladies-in-waiting, who served as mirrors of another sort, and be assessed. A tilt of the head, a murmur of approval, a quiet frown that meant something must be redone. Only then could we step out into the corridors, into the gaze of the court, wearing the mask that the day required. For the servants, there was another kind of cruelty. They saw the toll beauty took, the sewers from lead paste, the thinning hair from caustic dyes, the faint tremors of mercury poisoning, yet they were powerless to refuse. If a lady demanded more powder, they brought it. If she fainted from a too tight bodice, they loosened it just enough to keep her conscious, then laced it again. And though they did not risk the same poisons daily, their own worth was tied to how well they could craft the beauty of others. A maid who failed to please her mistress could be dismissed, or worse, shamed publicly. I began to understand, in those rooms thick with the scent of herbs and metal, that beauty was not a personal pursuit here. It was a collective effort, a production in which everyone, lady and servant alike, had a role to play, and if the performance failed, the blame was rarely placed on the audience. The candlelight in the dressing room flickers, and I let the sound of my voice soften until it is almost a whisper. Somewhere in the castle, a bell tolls the hour. The rustle of skirts, the murmur of women, the quiet clink of a brush being set down, all fade into the dim corridors beyond the door. The scene shifts now. We are no longer in the bright dressing rooms of the morning, but in a quieter place, my chamber at night, the candles burning low. Outside, the courtyard lies in darkness, save for the faint orange glow of the watchman's torch. My voice slows, sinking deeper into the hush of the hour. The hardest truth I learned was that beauty in our world had an expiration date, not written in law, but written in glances. The way the eyes of the court would slide past older women, the way laughter softened when it reached their ears, as if they were already half invisible. For a young woman, beauty was courtesy for one who had passed her so-called prime. It was a debt you could never repay. The church might speak of wisdom and virtue as the crown of age, but the court's gaze was elsewhere, fixed on smooth skin, bright eyes, hair still thick and shining. And so the older women fought in their own way. Some clung fiercely to the fashions of their youth, wearing the same pale powders and gilded hairpieces, though the face beneath had grown thinner, the skin more delicate. Others stepped quietly aside, dressing in darker colors, covering their hair, speaking less in gatherings, as if withdrawing before they could be pushed. I saw it happen to Dame Marguerite, the same woman who had first told me to pluck my brow. In my earliest days at court, she had been formidable, tall, regal, always dressed in the richest fabrics. But as the years passed, she appeared less and less in the public halls. When I visited her in her private chamber, I saw the little jars still lined on her table, powders, rouge, perfumes, but some sat unopened, their contents hardened with age. She smiled at me, but there was a tiredness in her eyes that I had not seen before. The psychological toll was not spoken of. We did not have words for it, not in the way you might now, but it was there, in the quiet despair that crept into the hearts of women who knew they could not meet the standard anymore. No matter how many hours they sat before the mirror, I felt it myself, though I was still young. Each new wrinkle at the corner of my mouth, each stray grey thread in my hair, seemed to whisper that time was passing, that my worth would diminish with it. There were days I woke and wished I could forego it all, the plucking, the powders, the gowns that pinched at the ribs, and simply walk into the hall as I was. But to do so would invite questions, pity, even scandal. Was I ill? Was I careless? Was I falling into sin by neglecting the gifts God had given? And yet, there were women who refused. Quietly, subtly, but undeniably. I remember Lady Angelini, a widow of nearly 50, who stopped wearing powder one spring. She kept her hair its natural silver, pinned simply at the back of her head, and chose gowns in deep, unornamented blue. At first, the whispers were cruel. She is given up, they said. But over time, something shifted. People began to speak of her dignity, her calm, the way she carried herself like someone who owed nothing to anyone. There was also Edith, a merchant's daughter who married into a minor noble family. She had never liked the brow-plucking fashion and refused it entirely, keeping her hairline as it was. Her husband supported her, though I suspect it was because he valued her spirit as much as her beauty. She was often mocked in her early years at court, but I noticed that in private, younger girls sometimes approached her for advice, not on cosmetics, but on managing estates, negotiating prices, and reading contracts. These acts of defiance were small, but they were powerful. They reminded me that beauty was not the only currency we possessed, though it was often the most loudly demanded. Still, they were the exception, not the rule. For most of us, the pressure never lifted. The dressing rooms remained full each morning, the powders and poisons still applied. The mirror still the silent judge of our success or failure. And the mind, the mind could be worn thin by it. Every flaw, real or imagined, became a weight. A blemish could feel like a disgrace. A hint of tiredness around the eyes might be enough to make you want to hide from the day entirely. There were no kindly voices to tell us that beauty changes, that worth remains. Instead, there were the ever-watchful glances of the court, the sermons warning against vanity, the merchants eager to sell us one more jar, one more rinse, one more hope in a painted box. I sometimes think the cruelest part was how thoroughly we believed it. No one had to chain us to the mirror. We went willingly, each morning, ready to judge ourselves by a measure we had not chosen, and when we failed to meet it, the disappointment was our own, carried quietly behind painted lips. The candlelight wavers now, throwing long shadows on the walls. Outside, the night deepens, and somewhere a door closes softly, as if not to disturb the stillness. The fire in the hearth has burned low, the room steeped in warmth and shadows. My voice is softer now, almost like a confession, the kind one makes when the night is too deep for pretense. I have often wondered what it would feel like to live in a world without mirrors, to wake and dress and speak to others without once seeing my own face reflected back at me. In the medieval world, we did not have mirrors as you know them now. No sharp silver-backed glass to catch every detail. Ours were polished metal or small pieces of glass, often warped, often dim, and yet they were enough to make us our own harshest critics. In truth, the greatest mirror was not in the chamber, but in the eyes of others. Their glances, lingering or dismissive, approving or disapproving, told us whether we had succeeded that day in being pleasing. And in that way, I think our world was not so different from yours. You might think these old standards have long since been buried with the gowns and the golden hairpieces, but look closely at the paintings in your museums. The way they're described, the youthful bloom, the flawless complexion, the ideal proportions. Now step into your own world. The magazines, the screens, the endless tide of faces presented for judgment. The tools have changed. The message has not. In my day, we risked our health with white lead powder and mercury-based rouges. Now, there are other dangers, chemical peels, injections, surgeries, all in the name of reaching a standard set somewhere outside oneself. Then, it was the court and the church whispering in your ear now. It is the glow of 1,000 small screens. The faces may be different, but the pressure feels hauntingly familiar. When I look back, I do not only see the cruelty, I also see the quiet resilience. Women finding ways to help each other. slipping a safer recipe for a face powder into a friend's hand, telling a younger girl she is already beautiful without the plucking, choosing not to mock an older woman who had let herself go. These were small mercies, but they were the cracks in the wall. The greatest lesson, I think, is this: a beauty standard is only as strong as our belief in it. It feeds on our compliance, on the hours we spend chasing it. When you stop, truly stop, it begins to starve. I know this because I left. It was not a single, defiant moment. No, it was gradual. A missed morning of powdering because I had overslept. A day when I wore my hair loosely because the pins had gone missing. An evening when I chose to laugh instead of worrying whether my cheeks were too red from the heat. And slowly, the mirror's voice grew quieter. The world did not end. The people who truly cared for me stayed. Those who turned away had never been mine to keep. By the time I reached my own middle years, I had traded the long hours before the mirror for walks in the garden, for reading by the fire, for the soft, unhurried pleasure of simply existing. My gowns were still fine, but they were chosen for comfort as much as display. I will not pretend that the whispers ceased. They did not, but they began to sound less like commands and more like the rustle of leaves outside the window, something I could notice or ignore as I pleased. In this low light, with the fire's glow flickering against the walls, the truth feels simple. Beauty standards will change. They will rise and fall, twist and reform. Some will be cruel, as they were in my time. Others will pretend to be kinder. But the choice, whether to bow to them or to live in your own skin, is yours in a way we never fully understood back then. And so, as the night slips toward dawn, I leave you with this: put down the mirror, just for a while. Step into the quiet. Listen for the sound of your own voice, your own breath. Remember that your worth was never meant to be measured by the smoothness of your skin, the shine of your hair, or the cut of your gown. We could not always choose such freedom in my day. You can. The fire sighs and settles into embers. My voice fades to a whisper, not from weariness, but from peace. The bells in the square are ringing, slow at first, then faster, until the sound feels like sunlight spilling into every alley. I speak softly to you now, as if we're standing at the edge of the festival, cloaked in the smell of roasted meat, damp stone, and a dozen perfumes drifting on the breeze. Feast days were never only about devotion. Yes, there were the saints to honor, the prayers to recite, the solemn processions with gilded relics carried high on velvet cushions. But they were also, always, about being seen. The square became a stage, and we, its players. Long before the bells rang, the work began. Servants carried buckets of water from the well, heating it in heavy iron pots until the steam rose in thick clouds. The noble ladies and the merchants' wives who could afford it would wash their faces and hands in the warm water, scented with rosemary or lavender, to soften the skin. Then came the powders, white lead to brighten the complexion, carefully brushed on with goose feather fans, a whisper of vermilion on the lips and cheeks. For hair, ribbons were ironed smooth, flowers threaded into braids, caps starched until they held their shape like parchment. You might imagine all this as joyful, and it could be, but it was also exhausting. We knew that any flaw would be noticed. A patch of sunburn from the fields, a crooked hem, a stain on the sleeve, all would be read as signs of negligence. and negligence was not merely a personal failing, but a statement about one's family, one's worthiness to be in certain company. The festival itself was a moving mirror. In the crowd, every face turned into a reflection of your own beauty or lack of it. A quick glance from a nobleman's son could warm you 4 weeks. A raised eyebrow from another lady could pierce like a needle. And then there were the contests, not always official, but understood, who wore the finest gown, whose hair shone brightest in the sun, who had grown pale and thin over the winter, and who had grown plump from too many pastries. Behind the facades, there were quiet tragedies. I once saw a girl faint in the middle of the Corpus Christi procession. She had tightened her girdle so severely to achieve the ideal narrow waist that her breath could not keep pace with the march. Servants carried her into the shade, fanning her with palm leaves, while whispers rippled through the crowd. Pity mingled with a certain cruel satisfaction. And yet, there were moments of grace, in the music, in the scent of fresh bread, in the flash of a child's smile with jam smeared across her cheeks. There were small reminders that beauty could exist without artifice. I began to hold on to those moments like charms, tucking them away to remember when the mirrors and powders felt too heavy to bear. When the day ended and the streets lay empty under the stars, the beauty of the festival faded quickly. Hairpins were pulled free, gowns unfastened, paint washed away to reveal the tired faces beneath. It was a relief and a loss all at once, for in the medieval world, feast day beauty was not only a performance for others, it was, for some, the only time they felt truly alive. The fire is low again, a soft orange thread in the dim room. My voice is close now, like a secret shared over clasped hands. We are stepping into the chambers where matches are made, not by hearts, but by calculations. In the medieval world, beauty was never only yours. It belonged to your family, to be shown, traded, and leveraged. A fair face could bring a richer dowry, a more powerful alliance, or even the ear of a king. I knew girls who were taught from childhood to turn their heads at just the right angle when they laughed, to keep their skin covered from the sun, so they might appear pale and untouched, not for themselves, but for the man they might one day marry. Courtship, when it happened, was rarely private. A glance across a banquet table was a performance for an audience of 100. A stroll in the garden was often accompanied by watchful chaperons, noting whether the gentleman admired your delicacy or your bearing. The words they used were telling: delicate, meaning thin wrists, narrow shoulders, the kind of fragility that suggested you had never labored. Bearing, meaning posture so upright it bordered on unnatural, signaling discipline and obedience. Love poems were common, but they were almost never written to capture a woman's soul. They were written to praise her hair, her lips, her whiteness, proof that she met the court's vision of perfection. And yet, those same poems could be political tools. A sonnet whispered in the right ear neared sway a negotiation, open a door, seal a promise. But beauty's power was double-edged. A woman renowned for her looks could become a target for envy, gossip, even suspicion. She uses witchcraft, they would say, if her beauty seemed too enduring. Or, she's vain, if she dared to dress more richly than her station. I once knew a lady whose marriage was secured purely because of the way she looked when she danced. The fall of her gown, the glint of candlelight on her hair. She wed a wealthy lord twice her age. Within months, the beauty that had won her value became her cage. He dressed her in jewels and silks, yes, but he also forbade her from speaking too freely or laughing too loudly. Her role was to be admired, not heard. In lower ranks, beauty held different stakes. A miller's daughter might not be painted in poems, but her prettiness could still draw the eye of a prosperous tradesman, or the unwelcome interest of a noble who could take what he wanted without offering marriage. For her, beauty was not a coin to be spent, but a debt that could be called in at any time. And yet, love did exist. I knew couples who saw beyond the painted face and elaborate braids, who fell in love in the quiet spaces, in shared glances during vespers, in laughter over spilled wine, in the ease of seeing one another without the day's careful armor. Those loves, when they survived, were precious, but they were rare. Marriage was often the end of courtship's delicate dance, but not the end of the beauty game. A wife was expected to maintain her looks, to present herself in a way that reflected her husband's wealth and taste. To age was not a sin, exactly, but it was a kind of betrayal to the image he had married. And so, the mirror followed a woman from the first days of maidenhood to the last days of her marriage, never letting her forget that in the eyes of her world, beauty was not hers alone. The air is colder now. I speak more softly, as though we stand in a stone chapel where the only sound is the faint drip of water from the roof. The candles here burn low, their light trembling over carved angels who seem to be listening. Illness was one of the few moments in a medieval woman's life when beauty might be forgiven, but never entirely. Even when fever burned the cheeks and sweat beaded the brow, there were quiet instructions whispered by mothers or attendants. Keep the hair neat, the linens clean, the mouth moistened, so the lips did not crack. It was not only for dignity, it was for visitors, the priest, the neighbors, the kin who would remember you as you were in your prime. No one wanted to be remembered as the hollow-eyed figure beneath the blankets, even if that was the truth. I recall a noble woman in Rouen who, during her final illness, insisted her maid apply a faint dusting of white powder to her cheeks each morning. Her reasoning was simple. If I am to meet my Maker, I wish to look well in his presence. Was it faith? Was it vanity? Perhaps in her mind, they were one and the same. Mourning, too, had its beauty codes. Black gowns were not shapeless sacks of grief. They were carefully cut, sometimes lined with fur, often sewn with subtle patterns of embroidery, notable only in candlelight. The veil, drawn over the face, could hide tears, but also framed the wearer in a kind of solemn elegance. Widows of means were expected to be the picture of restrained sorrow, their beauty muted, but still discernible beneath the fabric. Those who failed to appear appropriately, to pale, to unkempt, to raw in their grief, might be called mad or immodest. In poorer households, mourning dress might simply mean wearing one's best clothes, regardless of color, kept tidy for the day of the funeral. But even here, there was pressure. A frayed hem could be read as disrespect. A smudge of soot on the cheek might be whispered about as carelessness in the face of death. Death itself was no escape from beauty's reach. Bodies were washed, hair combed, hands folded neatly over the chest. Sometimes a pinch of rouge was applied to the cheeks of the deceased to give them the appearance of peaceful sleep. Wealthier families might even commission a death mask, a wax or plaster cast of the face, smooth to erase lines, as if the person had been restored to their most perfect self in the afterlife. And then came the memory making. In the stories told after, beauty was often exaggerated, especially if the woman had been loved or admired in life. Her hair was like gold, they would say, though perhaps it had been only a warm brown. Her skin like milk, though in truth it had been lined from years of work in the fields. In this way, beauty clung to the dead as stubbornly as it did to the living. I often wondered if this was a kindness, a way to keep the loved one alive in the mind, or a cruelty, erasing the reality of who they had been in favor of an impossible image. Even now, I'm not sure. In the medieval world, beauty was not just for the young, the healthy, the joyous. It was a thread woven through every stage of life. And yes, even through death. A thread that could bind, choke, or, occasionally, offer a final, fleeting grace. I speak now as though the fire has burned down to embers. My words fall softly into the hush, a winding down, a gathering of threads. This is the part where memory blurs with reflection. The world changes, or so we tell ourselves. But I have walked through enough seasons to know that some threads, the ones woven deep, do not break so easily. In my youth, I thought beauty was a kind of armor, that if I learned the tilt of the head, the curve of the smile, the way to lace a gown, so that it flattered, I might protect myself from the cruelties of the world. I did not yet understand that armor can also be a chain. I remember the first time I saw my own reflection and did not recognize her. It was not that the mirror lied. It was that it told a truth I had been trained to avoid. The lines at the corner of my eyes, the silver at my temples, they were not ugly. Yet they did not belong to the woman the world had wanted me to be. And that world, for all its feasts and music and painted chapels, had always preferred its women preserved in the springtime of their looks. But here is something the poets never told us. When the court stopped looking at me, I began to see myself more clearly. Without the weight of constant watching, I discovered other ways to stand, to speak, to fill a room. I learned that beauty, as they taught it, was not the only kind. There was beauty in the steady hands that mended torn linens, in the knowledge of herbs that eased a cough, in the stories that could make even a grieving friend laugh. I think now of the young women I once saw flitting through the great halls, their laughter rehearsed, their hair so heavy with pins it gave them headaches. I want to take them by the hands and tell them, quietly, so no one else hears, that the gaze of others is not the same as love. The mirror still hangs in my chamber. Its frame is darkened with age, the glass clouded in one corner. Sometimes I pass it without looking. Other times I pause, not to check whether my hair is neat or my cheeks are pale, but to see if I can recognize the woman inside. She is not the girl the world wanted. She is not the bride they bargained for, nor the widow they dressed in mourning silk. She's someone else, someone freer, and perhaps that is the final defiance. Not powders, not silks, not the perfect bow of the head, but living long enough to outlast the standards meant to keep you small. So if beauty was a chain, I have learned, it is also a key, though you must forge it yourself, link by link, year by year. And when you finally unlock that door, you may find, as I did, that the truest kind of beauty is the one that no one else gets to measure. That is the story I leave you with. The rest, you will have to write for yourself.